Okay, well, we will go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone, or morning, depending on where you're joining us from. If we have not yet met, my name is Ariel Kaler, and I'm new to the SER team as of 2025. I am our sales analyst and outreach manager here at SER, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to Strategic Economic Research's July webinar, From Crops to Kilowatts, Navigating the Land Use Debate with Data. Just a few housekeeping items to get us started. First, the Q&A feature has been enabled for this session, so please add your questions as you think of them, and we will be sure to answer them at the end. Second, we are recording this webinar, and we will send it out to everyone who registered once the recording is ready. Now that we have that out of the way, we have two incredible speakers for you today, Sawyer Keith Lee and Brian Loomis. They are going to discuss an improved product deliverable that we rolled out earlier this year, a standalone 25-plus page land use analysis. We've seen this be really beneficial to developers when going through the permitting process for their projects. Those who are familiar with our work know that we used to include this in our full analysis, our 30 to 45 page economic impact report, but we decided to break it out into its own report so that developers can use it as a resource when needed for their permitting applications and community engagement strategy. With that, Brian, please take it away.
Thanks, Ariel. So I am Brian Loomis. I'm a vice president here at SER. I've been with the company for about 6 years. We've done quite a few projects, primarily in renewable energy, wind, solar, and battery storage. And we've supported lots of developers at permitting hearings. And so this new rework of the way that we handle land use really comes out of experience with what we're hearing in those hearings, and how we can sort of best support developers. So we'll talk through some of those things that we've been hearing and some of the best arguments that developers can make around land use to get projects permitted. So, if you've been in many permitting hearings, you've probably heard something about interstate medians for solar. Local opposition likes to bring up, oh, well, why can't we just put all of the solar panels on interstate medians? Why does it have to be on this land that's currently being used for agriculture or other uses? Why can't we just put it, in places where it's not going to bother me, a resident, and that's sort of a simplistic way of looking at things, and the type of things that you're going to hear in these hearings. But the real we want really at SER, we're analysts and statisticians, so we want to look at the data and see, okay, what actually is available for developers, and interstate medians, it's a small amount of land really in terms of the total land in any state, and developers also don't have access to it. So I think at one point the federal government was looking into something like this. It's also poses difficulties with interconnection, poses difficulties for construction to be doing a large scale construction project in the middle of an interstate. So there are a lot of issues, and so we want to move away from sort of the simplistic way of looking at things and actually look at how are we using land in the US, and what's a good use versus a bad use. So if you go to the next slide here, I've pulled up, the USDA did a study of the current land use in the US, and it hasn't changed dramatically in the past 8 years here, but you can see we have several categories. The three biggest are pasture and rangeland, forest use land, which would include, commercial timber, and cropland are really the three biggest. There's some special use, which includes parks and wildlife. A lot of the special use is not available for solar. You can't put solar on a natural national park. And then miscellaneous also isn't super useful for solar. It's hard to do large scale construction projects and it wouldn't work well on those types of lands. Urban land, you've got, rooftop solar, but that's really a small portion of the land in the US. And so if we're talking about adding solar, the land that's really available to developers is going to fall into those three biggest buckets. And if you're going to eliminate those top three, there's not a lot of potential sites that you can use as a developer. And so really getting comfortable with the arguments around these and do we need this much land in the US for these uses, or can we transition some of it to energy is going to be really important. So when you look at the research and especially around agricultural use, which when we're talking about solar developers in terms of building projects, it's been about 75% from what I've seen that have been put on land that was previously used for agriculture. And agriculture has undergone big shifts in the previous, decades as well, where more and more of that agricultural output is going towards corn ethanol for corn or biodiesel for soybeans. And so you're seeing more and more of this agricultural land being used for energy anyway. You're producing energy via corn ethanol or biodiesel, or you're producing energy using solar. And so we like that because it's easy to compare the two of them, and research has shown that on an energy equivalent basis, if you put solar on something that was previously used for corn and had been getting sold to produce corn ethanol, you can produce the same amount of energy in just 3.2% of the land use footprint. So it's a very efficient use to generate energy versus corn ethanol. And so if you actually dive into the research and look at some of the trends, then we think you can make a pretty compelling case to convert agricultural land into solar for that reason and a number of others that we'll be getting into today. The other thing that I want to bring up before we really dive into things is you need to think about who your audience is when you are talking about land use, because land use is a very broad term that means a lot of different things to different people, and people will care about different things in regards to the land depending on who they are. So the stakeholders that you're speaking to are very important, and you're going to want to approach them different ways with different arguments. So for example, economic development is going to care about job loss in regards to agriculture first and foremost. So they're going to want you to be able to look at, okay, what's the job loss? What are the ripple effects in terms of, fertilizer and seed that we sell in the county or the state that's no longer going to be sold because this land is no longer used for agriculture and that sort of thing. Landowners are going to care mostly about profits for agriculture versus the solar lease. And so that's an entirely different argument and a different set of things that you're looking at. The Farm Bureau may care more about keeping the land in production just for philosophical reasons to feed the world. You can get into some less data-driven arguments or more subjective, we needed this ag land in production because X or Y. Local opposition might be the same way. Some of those arguments may not be in good faith, but they do still need to be dealt with. And so that's really what we're trying to do here. And so if you go to the next slide here, Ariel, I've laid out some of the questions that you're going to need to address as a developer with regards to land use. So what's the quality and usefulness of the land for its current use versus its proposed use. So you can compare the two and look at how the land is being used and not only look at its productivity for agriculture or timber or whatever it's currently being used for, but also its suitability for solar use, which you all are well familiar with. But those are arguments that you can present of, hey, this is a great site. We can connect onto the grid. It's useful for X and Y reasons. So those are the types of points that you want to be making. Um, the jobs and economic output of the current use versus the proposed use, like I mentioned. Um, does taking the land out of its current use adversely impact that industry's ability to function? And does it make sense that we need less of this land sort of on a nationwide trend level? For agriculture, what are the end uses of the crops being grown if you can show that these, crops are going towards energy anyway, or are going towards things that are not as important locally to stakeholders as, food on the table, which often crops that are being grown in these areas are not going to, the grocery store aisle and the vegetable aisle in your grocery store, then that can be helpful. And then what profits can the landowner expect to make under the current use versus the proposed use? Very important to look at that as well and show that the landowners are making a reasonable economic decision. We're economists, and so we love landowners who make reasonable economic decisions, and we find that most of them are by taking a solar lease versus continuing to farm. That brings us to this land use analysis that we're doing now. We had been looking previously, and we've been doing land use for a while, and it was really focused on the landowner profits piece of things. But as we were going to these permitting hearings, we were hearing a lot more sorts of things around land use, and we felt that we had the analytical background and could wade through some of the research and arguments and come up with some compelling arguments that solar is a good use of a lot of the land where projects are being built. And so we started digging in and finding some good data and looking at what it was telling us about using land for solar versus agriculture. We've also begun doing timber land use as well and grazing land use, so we can support those land uses as well. Still, primarily, what we're seeing is solar is getting put on land previously used for agriculture, and that's a really compelling transition for a couple of reasons that I'll talk about in a moment. But we can support those other uses as well and create these reports. So the first thing that we wanted to look at was the actual land where the project is being built. We'd hear lots of landowners, local opposition talking about this is prime farmland. We can't be giving up this prime farmland and putting solar on it. And so we did want to look at, can we find the actual classification of the land, and then what does it mean that that a parcel is on prime farmland, and does that mean that it needs to be in agriculture, or do we have enough prime farmland nationwide to go around, which Sawyer is going to get into a little bit more. We also look at the soil quality because that can tell you a lot beyond just that prime farmland, which is more of a binary distinction. But we look at that and how good shape the soil is in, and we can look at the actual parcels involved in the land control and really dive into the data for the actual site. see the crops that have been grown there for the past 5 years and really create a good analysis that looks at the actual parcels and their productivity, their patterns of growth, and compare that to the solar use. So we've been able to get a lot more granular with the data that we're including now. We also have gotten requests for this for a while, and it's I think a good thing to look at. We're now including the expected economic impacts from agricultural use in order to compare them to the expected impacts from solar use. So if you've worked with us before, you know that we primarily do economic impact reports for renewable energy projects. So we're looking at the jobs, the income, the economic output under solar use. And so we're giving those numbers so that developers can go and circulate those and tell local communities what they can expect to receive in economic output. Um, we've gotten requests as well and some local pushback that we ought to be looking at the economic impacts from agriculture for that are being, removed if you're transitioning from agriculture to solar use. You're taking agricultural land out of production, then you should look at the jobs and income lost from agriculture. And those are small, but it's something it's a valid analysis that we can do of look at the solar, look at the agriculture, and compare the two and net them out to get the net impact of solar use. So that's now included in this land use report as well. It's also now required in the state of Ohio if you file economic impacts. They want you to also show the net impacts, so net out the agricultural use. Other states may follow suit too, so we now have the ability to take a look at that and have a good method for doing that. We also look at some of the really important trends in agriculture. So with technological advancement over, the past 40 years, we'll look at some of the crops that have increased their yields. So you can get more of the crop out of less land. So we've seen this for corn and soybean, which are very common crops that are being taken out of production, having solar put on the land that they were used for. It's also happening for wheat and cotton. Those are a little less common, but it is still something that we can look at. So if you can produce the same amount of agriculture with less land, then you can look at the county as a whole and say, okay, if this county has 100,000 acres of agricultural land, and we take 1,000 acres out of production and put a solar farm on it, that remaining 99,000 year over year, because yields historically have been increasing year over year for decades, that remaining 99,000 acres of land can produce the same amount of crop that the 100,000 acres was before, usually within a year. So if you take out, and we'll look in our reports specifically at the county, the project size, and if you take the land out of production, how long does it take until you're getting the same amount of crop, the same amount of corn and soybean that the county was producing before? And usually it's within a year because it's a small amount of the total agricultural land that's being taken out of production. And these yield increases are very significant. We're producing more crop than we used to because we're getting more efficiency out of the land. And with that efficiency, we can transition some of the land to other uses. We also take a look at the landowner profits. Solar leases not only offer higher expected profits on average than agriculture, the landowners can expect to to make more money under a solar lease, but they also offer certainty of that that solar lease money is coming in. You don't have to worry about prices dropping. And so we run simulations based on historical county level data on profits from farming and compare those to the anticipated solar lease. And we simulate multiple futures. Really, we run 500 simulations to see what's the range of outcomes here. If prices spike, what does that do? If profits drop, what does that do? And are any of these going to be better than the solar lease? Sometimes there are a few, but more often there are no of the 500 simulations that are expected to be more profitable than the solar lease. It just depends on the profitability of the area, the expected solar lease, etc. But it does make a very compelling argument from a profit standpoint in most cases. All right, with that, I will turn it over to Sawyer to take a deeper look at some of the specific data. And we basically ran an example report here so we can show what this looks like practically in these reports. So take it away, Sawyer.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you, Ariel, for that wonderful introduction. Hi, everyone. My name is Sawyer Keithley, and I have been working with strategic economic research for the last 4 years. And as Brian said, we have completed over 600 wind, solar, and battery storage reports. I received a master's in science in applied economics with a sequence in electricity, natural gas, and telecommunications. So for our example report, we broke it down into the same sections that we would for your traditional land use report. And the first one covers the current and proposed usage statistics. So for this example project, we included estimates based off of our previous experience with other land use projects. And it's covering approximately 1,600 acres of land. We wanted to show and highlight the quality of the agricultural land as before we discuss the quality of the solar instead of it. So we were able to narrow down our field of vision from rather than a county level estimation using the top crops in the county. Now we are able to use the USDA National Agricultural Services cropland data layer to find the specific crops grown on the project area land over the last 5 years, which gives us a good idea of what the top two crops in the area are and the specifics of this particular land. This gives us better estimation when it comes to our economic impacts of that agricultural land so that we can give it the most specificity possible. So here you can see that our top two crops in our example land are corn and soybeans. The next piece that we look at is the National Commodity Crop Productivity Index ratings. And here you can see that there is a significant number of the acreage that is moderately high productivity. And this is from the Natural Resource Commodity Service Web Soil Survey. And this information is really important to show that we care about the agricultural land and we recognize that there is some productivity behind it. But if we go to the next slide, we'll see that the prime farmland in the United States, the percentage of farmland taken out of production, it does not amount to enough to significantly alter the total production of those crops within the nation, but especially within the state. On the right, you'll see we have a pie chart that represents the land classifications for the exact project footprint. So similar to the cropland data layer, we're able to view the exact specifics and see which areas are prime farmland. And this example has prime farmland if drained, which would be a massive undertaking for the farmer to bring that soil up to the same quality as that other prime farmland. And in the report, we even highlight a percentage. It's a fraction of a percentage of the prime farmland in the state. So even those states that have, those lower acreage of prime farmland across them, the projects with their acreage taken out of agricultural land are still a fraction of a percentage of that prime farmland in the state. Another piece that is very important for developers, but also for the potential disruption of roads or other general construction efforts that might be made for these projects, is the distance of the project to transmission lines. As some of you may be familiar, the siting of these projects near those can drastically reduce the not only cost to construct those transmission lines to connect to the grid, but also can reduce the amount of sort of community upheaval when it comes to construction and bringing in trucks and sort of closing off roads or whatever may be coming from that construction of the transmission line to connect it. So we include a specific project map of where the solar project will be in regards to what transmission lines are around it and the kilovolts of the transmission lines near it. So that provides a bit of a visual example of why this area is important. Another thing that we think is very important is highlighting the amount of solar that these panels will receive. So here we have the NREL or Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory map that they created to show the global horizontal solar irradiance in the United States. And it measures the kilowatt hours per meter squared per day that is received by, a little meter squared parcel of land. And then they aggregated that data across these states to give a better idea of how much solar these panels would receive. So even those northern states with that more or that less concentrated color still are important for solar project building, because there is an increased need for renewable energy, but there's also an increased need for access to it, not only through those southern states that have those extreme levels of solar, but those northern ones are also experiencing many projects being built in them. So the next piece that we look at is the economic impacts of shifting agricultural land to solar use. So as Brian said earlier, the net impacts have become more of a hot button topic. And even last night, I had a question at a testimony hearing from the county board where they were curious about, well, what are the impacts of taking this agricultural land out of production for the supply chain and local seed or fertilizer companies? And this is what we kind of highlight with this section of the report. Here I have just pulled the employment numbers, but we do also calculate, similar to our full report, the employment, the labor income, and the output or gross domestic product that is a result of the project being built. So here you'll see that the annual values for those employment numbers would be about 5.8 jobs per year. When compared to the solar employment, even the annual operations of the solar project far exceed that agricultural annual impact. And we also provide a visualization with those graphs down there. And then the next sort of breakdown that we do of those net impacts is showing the math. We don't want the reader to have to do mental math, but we provide the difference between them. So these numbers represent the net impacts of the solar project during construction and during operations. So we just subtract those out for you so that it's a little bit more visibly obvious. So the next part that we like to highlight is the agricultural trends. What happens if this land is taken out of production and we can't feed our families, or we need those crops to help with our local ethanol production, or different things like that that are brought up by concerned community members. So the first thing we like to do to kind of comfort that worry is show the historical yield increase of those top two crops in the county. Or the top two crops in the project area. So here we have an example of the soybeans in McLean County, which is where we placed our example project. And you'll see that the yields in terms of bushels per acre have increased dramatically since 1990. And it's about a 40 bushel per acre difference between the lowest and the highest points, which means that there's less need for land necessarily in terms of replacing it with these projects. So it's a matter of time before the yields from the other areas in the county will replace what was lost, which we show here in this graph. So this is the expected production of soybeans in that county with the decreased acreage. So you'll see that from 2025 until about 2027, the production continues as expected. And then you see just the slightest dip. And that represents the acreage being taken out of production because of the project. But you can honestly barely tell the difference, and you'll notice that it returns back to that same trajectory that it was on before within a year of that acreage being taken out of production. Another key thing that we like to bring up is the end uses for those crops. So we have the corn end uses here, and you'll notice that the number of acres, or number of bushels used for corn, it has shifted in the way that it's requested or used in that production element. So starting in about 2004, the increase of using corn for ethanol started to trend upwards. And then in around like 2008, 2010, things really started to level off. And this kind of represents the increased demand and improvements of technology to make that corn ethanol more efficient to create. But this solar project would create, a fraction, or we would, the corn used for ethanol would represent a fraction of the solar that would be generated by this project in the same amount of time, or even less time. And similarly, we have the end uses for soybeans. So this one was a little bit more of a recent trend in the shift upward for use of soybeans in fuel production, especially within, since about 2019 or so, things have begun increasing. But this still highlights that the amount of the crops used for food or livestock feed, as opposed to fuel, is it's becoming a bit muddier in the difference between them. And so replacing this small amount of land, whether it's for livestock or it's for fuel production, can really dramatically increase the amount of energy that this land is producing. Another thing that I'm sure some of you are familiar with, that is the landowner profits. There's a concern: why should a farmer remove land from their agricultural practices and have it be used for this solar project? And why would it be beneficial for them to have that over 30 years or so during the life of that project? Will this be beneficial for them in the long run? Will it be beneficial for them in the short run? So we break this down using the USDA's state statistics and county statistics, specifically surrounding farms. So specifically, we break it down into a profit per acre that we then use in simulations, like Brian had said before, to estimate how much are the minimum and maximum that this farmer might experience in terms of the profits from continued agricultural use in the future. And then we can compare that against the value of that solar lease that would be consistent across that time, because the variations in yield and prices can fluctuate. So this leads us to our simulations of real profits per acre based on the data from 1992. Now, that's not just 1992. We use data from the 5-year census. It's from 1992, 97, 2002, and so on up until 2022. And this provides us with a more accurate trend line to simulate these real profits per acre. And we still find that throughout these simulations, the landowners are better off under the solar lease in, I would say, almost always, over like 95% of those 500 simulations, they're better off. So it's really important that we showcase that the solar companies are taking care of the landowners, and that this provides a steady source of income while they might have losses elsewhere in their farming practices. And I'll hand this back to Brian to finish it off.
Thanks, Sawyer. So we have just some things to wrap up. Like I mentioned, we can support not only the agricultural land use that we've primarily focused on today, we can also take a look at the timber use land that's currently being used for timber production, and we can look at grazing and pasture land. There are a different set of things that we look at for each of those industries to create a report, but we really did want to focus on agriculture today because that's primarily where solar is being built. Though we have seen an increase in projects going on timberland recently, and so we've done quite a few of those in the past 3 or 4 months. One other thing that I wanted to make clear is that this report, it's a separate report now instead of a section of our economic impacts report. It's meant to be a companion still to the economic impact report. The reason that we separated it out is so to give developers a little more flexibility with what they'd want to file with their permitting applications. So if you want to file this land use report along with the economic impact report, you can do so, or you can just have it in your back pocket as questions come up, address the issues with actual data related to the project's use as they come. So it gives a little more flexibility, but it still is dependent on that economic impact report. In that report, we're calculating the jobs, earnings, property taxes, and a variety of other things for the project. And so the land use report builds off of that, particularly in the net economic impact. So we need that economic impact analysis report done to do the land use report. We can do both at the same time. So that is an option. But if you have already done an economic impact report for a project with us, want to add on a land use report at a later time, that also is an option. And we see lots of developers do this sort of thing as they're gearing up for their permitting hearings and starting to engage more with these questions. But we do see lots of developers engaging communities a lot earlier in the process and really tackling these questions before opposition can grow sort of unchecked. So that's also a good way to do things. So that said, if you're interested in hearing more about these land use reports or getting one set up for your projects, you can email Ariel. Her email address is right there, and she'd be happy to chat with you about your particular project and needs and get you some more information. So with that, I will hand it back over to Ariel.
Great. Thank you, Brian and Sawyer. We have a few Q&A questions, so if you do have questions, please drop them in the Q&A section. You can find that at the bottom of the Zoom meeting. So our first question was about the 2017 USDA Economic Research Service. Do we know when and if these statistics are updated, given that it's approaching about 10 years old?
Sure. So I suspect that the 2017 data that the ERS is basing this report that I pulled that chart from, I suspect that it's based on the census data, which is updated every 5 years, as Sawyer was saying, and we use that data for the profit per farm and a whole bunch of other things that go into the land use analysis. So the 2022 survey was completed. So I think the data should be available for this, but somebody just needs to aggregate it, and I haven't seen the ERS do that. The 2022 survey, that data didn't become available through the USDA until a couple of years after then. I think it was 2024 that we finally got access to it and were able to incorporate it. But I haven't seen the nationwide land use updated from that 2022 survey, so I'd be very interested in seeing that as well, but I don't think it has been updated, and I don't know what the priority is for doing so, but I would love to see that data too and get something a little more recent because 8 years is quite a bit of time.
Great, thanks, Brian. We did have someone ask if the report and the slides will be available after this. The answer is yes, we will send that information out via email whenever everything is ready.
Yes.
Another attendee asked, what is the average lease price for solar over the last 5 years?
Well, I see the ones that come in, but I don't have an aggregated answer for you. I suppose it can vary widely, and it varies depending on developers. A lot of developers do consider those lease prices proprietary, and so we don't publish those in these land use reports. We sort of have them in the back end for calculations and to run those comparisons, but we don't publish those publicly either. But the leases can vary, and it does depend on the area of the country, the current land use. I think most of the timber ones I've seen have been lower than solar, just based on experience. But yeah, it does depend.
Someone asked to clarify, to get a land use report, you must also have an economic impact report, and the answer to that question is yes.
Mm-hmm. Particularly for that net economic use. If you want to do something custom with us, we're analysts and we love to take on custom challenges as well. And so if you want to work out something with us and are truly just interested in some of these other pieces of the land use and not that economic impacts, then we could take a look at that, but we won't make any promises right now. We're primarily hoping for this to be a companion to those economic impact reports that are really useful for permitting as well, and we'd be happy to talk with you more about what those are and why they're so useful.
That's great. Thanks, Brian. Then someone asked if we had any data regarding soil quality or land productivity after the solar life cycle. I'm not sure if we would have information on that, but.
Sawyer, you want to take that one?
Yeah, I can take this one. So currently we don't have any information on that, but that is something that we would be willing to look into for a custom report or even for future research to include in our regular land use reports. So thank you for bringing that up.
Great.
We've found a few studies that we do include in those land use reports, not specific to solar, but just about letting land lie fallow and how that can improve land productivity in the future. So we've included the research that's available that we've seen. But yeah, we'd be happy to chat with you more after after. Yep.
Good. Thank you. The next question is and says, thanks for the discussion about ag land. Could you talk a bit more about your analysis on timberland? Does the approach differ than your analysis for agriculture?
Sure. So for timber, there are some of these arguments that you can't make for timber that you would make for agriculture. Things like the yield increase over time. We haven't seen that for timber. The pricing looks different, and so there's a different back end to doing the landowner profits piece of things. But the analysis on timberland, we still do look at the landowner profits. Timber is seems to be getting, less profitable over time, and so it does make for a pretty compelling case for solar on the landowner profit side, from what I've seen. We also do the net economic impacts piece for timberland, and we take a look at some of the relevant statistics for timber. You can gather sort of a different data sets from the web soil survey around tree site index and how good the soil quality is for timber as well. And so we take a look specific to that use on how things look, but we're really looking at some of the same issues. The sort of trends section, we can't make the same arguments about increased productivity and taking land away, but we think it still does make a pretty compelling argument because those landowner profits and the net economic impacts do look pretty compelling in the case of timber.
Great. Thanks, Brian. The next question is there ever a case where the net benefits are negative for solar? If so, why?
I can take
You
this
want this,
one.
Sawyer?
Yeah, I'll take this one. So great question. The net benefits for solar can be negative in the case that a county or area is highly productive in their agricultural values. And the price and the yields for the state are also very important. So if those yields are exponentially higher than those in surrounding counties or states, we would find that occasionally that the agricultural benefits would outweigh the solar during at least the operational phase. We find that the solar always is higher in the construction phase, but I'm sure that's not terribly surprising. But we do want to highlight the fact that even in the case of those extremely generous agricultural areas, we've tested this report and the analysis that we do against some very competitive areas, and we still find that the total impacts have outweighed the negative, if not in those broken out direct, indirect, and induced benefits. The totals usually went out in the end. But sometimes we would find that those potentially the induced benefits might be negative for the solar. So it's kind of a dependent on the situation and the area.
Perfect. Okay, our next question says, do you have any stats, info, or perspective with relation to tenant farmers who lease the land from the landowner? We've seen some concerns about landowners ending their leases with farmer tenants in order to host solar.
Yeah, so the way that we do our analysis, I would say, is pretty agnostic to whether it's the landowner that's farming or a farmer tenant, because we're taking into account the opportunity costs because we're economists. So we take into account, even if it's the landowner themselves, who is farming the land, we're taking into account the opportunity cost of that landowner's time that they could be going and doing other things. So that's sort of built into our modeling, that we are accounting for those particular costs, if that makes sense either way.
Great. This next question says, farmers and community leaders are aware of the data that we've been presenting. They have seen this frequently, and yet local and regional opposition can still occur. What other types of reasons for opposition can developers anticipate, and how can they address those less quantifiable reasons? I'm not sure that
Probably
works.
quantifiable.
Quantifiable, yes.
Yeah, this, I mean, this is a great question, and we do see, like I mentioned, a lot of these more philosophical or this is the way I feel types of opposition. And those are, just going to be, um, I, from my perspective, and this is coming from, a data person, but the best you can do is just show the facts and show your case and make a compelling argument the best you can. There are going to be some people who are just not willing to be convinced. So at some point you sort of need to just let it go and do your best, show the facts and data and sort of leave it at that in a lot of cases. So the I do think though some of the data can help to um like the feed the world argument of, we need this agricultural land. It's doing something really important. I feel like the yield increase can combat that pretty well. So by looking at the data, you can get a little bit of sort of solid ground to stand on and say, hey, this is a reason why that our particular argument doesn't hold water. But for some opposition, they're just not going to be willing to be convinced, and they're going to make arguments that by nature aren't, you can't prove either way. And so at that point, I think you just need to, sort of let it go. So
Yeah, if I can piggyback off that a little bit.
go ahead.
Um,
Yeah.
I think we've also found that even if the community leaders and the local community are well aware of the same facts as the report presents, it's still comforting for them to know that the developers are aware of the facts. So providing that visualization of the benefits of agriculture might provide them with a bit of ease of mind to show that the developers have done their due diligence and that they know the quality of the land that they'll be leasing. And it provides them with more direct acknowledgement of that value and acknowledgement of their fears and their voice being important. And then also the community engagement aspect of things can help a lot with those less quantifiable reasons. So before the matter even goes to a hearing, uh, targeting those specific concerns that the community has, whether it's through just discussions to help them work out their thought process and yours, or bringing in expert witnesses for those specific concerns can be very beneficial.
Great points. Thank you both. Another question we have is, how did shared land use analysis solutions like agrivoltaics compare in economic impact to just solar or just agriculture?
Hmm. So we have not done economic impacts for an agrivoltaics project, though I would love to be able to see, because I'm also very curious about this question. So we've really just looked at the trade-off between solar and agriculture. But we do know that this idea is gaining quite a bit of popularity and is something that we're sort of aware of, and I'd definitely be really interested to see how this would work out and what the efficiency trade-offs are like, and how things sort of end up comparing in the end for agrivoltaics. But we have not done this yet. So if you've got a project that you'd like to send our way where we could look at it, we would love to do it.
Perfect. Well, I think that brings us to the end of our Q&A questions. We'll be here for, another minute. If you have a last second question that you want to drop in, we'd be happy to answer it. I just want to give the floor back to Sawyer and Brian and see if they have any additional thing that they would like to add.
I don't think so. Thank you so much for coming, and great to chat with you all.
Perfect.
Yeah, thank you all so much.
Perfect. Well, then thank you both, Sawyer and Brian, so much for sharing your expertise. Thank you to everyone who was able to join us today. As a reminder, this webinar was recorded, so we will share it whenever it's ready, as well as an example report of the land use analysis. So we will see you all next time and have a great day.